Hi, this is Eric from Trekell Watercolor. So today I want to share with you two portraits of a same person. Our model is this beautiful girl on the left. Her name is Anastasia. So what you're looking at right now is I am drawing with Procreate in iPad Pro using my iPad pencil. This is a screen recording, that's why you don't see my pencil or my pen. And for this portrait, I decided to start with the basic structure of the head. This is a very important process because you need to understand the three-dimensional structure of a human head instead of just trying to outline the silhouette and start to draw the feature on it. If you do that, you are very likely to lose the three-dimensionality of the face. And especially for a portrait like this, where the lighting is not very distinct. This is likely a selfie next to a window, and there's no harsh direct light from outside the window, so overall lighting is very nice and soft, which is great for a photo, but a little bit more difficult for drawing because there's not a lot of contrast and not a lot of light and shadow you can play around with that can enhance the three-dimensionality of the face. So doing a structural drawing is going to be very helpful. So as you can see right now, the basic of it is we divided the face into three sections, from the hairline to the brow, and the brow to the bottom of the nose, and the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. That's the basic proportion of the human face. Now there might be a little bit of variations, depends on the person, but that's generally the basic proportion of a person. And for the most part, I usually eyeball those. I don't really take out a ruler and start to comparing them. I might use my hand to just roughly measure those, but usually I just eyeball those. So as you can see right now, I have a basic structure of the face. It's not really that pretty looking, it looks kind of weird, but that is a way to really get a nice structure of the face. So now is the time for me to start to refine those. The way I use Procreate is pretty similar to charcoal drawing. I made some custom brushes that looks like charcoals, and I also use smear when I need to get rid of something and to blend something. So it's pretty similar to charcoal drawing, except I don't really need to use charcoal. I actually don't have charcoal material. So Procreate sort of scratched my itch for a charcoal portrait. And the best thing about Procreate is that you can do it anywhere. So for example, this drawing is done when I was watching my kids going to bed. So the light wasn't on because they are sleeping, but since iPad has its own screen, I don't really need to turn on the light anywhere. So I start my rendering process with the eye. So I'm mainly focusing on separating the form, giving the form just a little bit more structure and dimensionality with a little bit of value. But I'm doing all this with the basic structure in mind. So if we didn't figure out the structure first and just start to go right into rendering, the portrait can fall apart very, very easily. But because when we are looking at a photo, we are only looking at the outside appearance of the face. So some students tend to just draw and paint what they see, but ignore what they should know. I remember back in the art school day, I have to do this structural drawing of the face many times. And the purpose is to get familiar with the structure of the face. And also by practicing a lot, you also learn it through muscle memory as well. So aside from the proportion, the alignment is also very important. The features should be aligned. The eye, the nose, and the mouth should have proper alignment. Sometimes when I see students doing a portrait, I see one eye's above the others and I see the mouth is a little bit crooked. Now the person could be smirking. I'm not saying that's entirely not possible, but likely not if you are drawing a typical portrait. So this is also very important. If you have facial features misaligned, it can look quite unnatural, and that's not going to look good. And no matter how well you render the features and how well you draw the shadows and everything, it's still going to look weird. So the process of my portrait drawing is to pretty much draw the structure, like the bone structure first. Then I start to draw the features and putting the flesh on the bone. How to render the face afterwards, that's up to the artist. But even if I stop at this stage right now, you can still tell that this is a human face. So I rendered out the facial features, and now I start to do a little bit more effect and rendering, try to make it look a little bit more refined. So kind of like smearing with my finger when I'm doing a portrait drawing. I smear with another brush so it can do some nice blending with it. Some edges needs to be a little bit softer so that we can interpret the transition from dark to light. Now since this one doesn't really have colors, so it's relatively easier. I just need to focusing on the value. It's actually pretty similar process to my value study. In watercolor, I start with a lighter value and I go into it a little bit deeper into middle value, then a dark value. So this is also a very good exercise for me to focus more on the structure of the face than the shadow, the lighting of the face, because again, the lighting is very soft. So all I really need to do is to draw a solid structure and start to give the features such as nose a little bit of the shadow underneath, a little bit of a dark underneath, just so that we can interpret the direction of lighting and it can still look nice and three-dimensional. So now I'm just using smearing and try to blend some edges, make some stuff looking a little bit nice and soft, but I also retain some of the hard edges so that it can retain its sense of structures. So I give it a little bit of background so it can show the shape of her shoulder, otherwise it will be just a head floating. That's not going to look that good. And I come back a little bit later and starting to decide to play with it a little bit, add a little bit of outline just to have some graphic quality to it, and I also refine some of the smearing and shading so that it looks a little bit more refined. And at this stage, you don't see any of the structural drawing underneath. But without those, it will be harder for me to come up with a solid head drawing. And here is the final drawing. I like how it turns out. It's nice and simple, and it does kind of translate the sweetness of her smile. I like it quite a bit. So here I decided to make this into a watercolor painting. I'm going to go extra fast on the drawing portion because we've been through that already, but also another chance to practice for me. And since this is not digital, I need to try to be extra careful as well, because once I start to paint, I am not able to correct it. However, the process is the same. I draw out the structure of the face, and now I draw the features a little bit more clear, and I erase some of the structural lines so I can paint it without all this line underneath the paint. So her face is very white, so I don't need a lot of value and color for the first wash. But I did pre-wet the surface so I can just paint some color of the light with a little bit more ease. So I start with the nose and painting outward. Since the paper is wet, everything that I paint will spread out pretty nice and soft. So I can give it a little bit of warm and cool and the basic skin tone of this portrait. I have another video sharing the color that I use for portrait painting and how to make skin tone. If you haven't watched that one, I strongly recommend you to watch that one. That is something that I use still today. Very easy and simple way to paint a nice natural looking skin tone. Now the first wash is dry, so I start to render the features on the face. starting with the eye. And as you can see, I try to connect the shape as much as possible. So starting with the eyelid, and I connect that with the iris, and now to the structure of the nose and the eye socket. And when I need to soften the edge, I use a clean damp brush to do so. So right now you can see it's all connected. It's all a single shape if you really think about it. It's just that I try to vary my brush stroke and the size of the shape and also the color. And now I expand that shape out to the side of her face. So her eyes to her cheek, all the way down to her chin and her neck. Connections, definitely very important when it comes to watercolor. I mention that a lot when I'm doing a scenery painting, but doing a portrait I think is just as important. That being said, these shapes are more complicated than typical scenery paintings, and it also requires a little bit more accuracy in your understanding of the facial structure, so it is definitely a little bit more tricky. But one thing to really remember is that no matter how small the shape is, we're painting shapes. And even though places like eyes has very thin, almost like line shape, but when you paint, try to think about shapes rather than drawing lines. It's a very important mindset to have, because when you're painting, you are still trying to interpret the structure of the face. So if you're starting to draw lines, start to outline things, you can lose that sense of structures very easily. So now I'm painting her nose. Her nose had a very distinct structure, so it's a joy to work with. Now down to her lips. I try not to define her lips too much because I don't want it to look too distinct and too separated. So I try not to paint too much when I just started. I try to paint as few shapes as I can. And if I need to add more detail later, then I'll add it later. But sometimes it's best to leave it as minimum as you can. And afterwards, you can look at it and decide if it needs more, especially with this lighting. Again, this is a very soft lighting, so we don't see a lot of dark cast shadow across her face. So don't emphasize on shadow too much. Just have enough contrast to show the structure of the face and you're good to go. Adding some dark on her hair so that we can see the contrast. So now you can see how dark it can be and the range of value. So once I put that hair down, everything else started to look a lot lighter. It's a good value reference. So now I start to add some transition, the planes on the left of her forehead. And now I also starting to add some dark to some of the details on the features. So the eyelid and the pupil, this little bit of darkness is actually going to make the eye sparkle. On the other eye as well. But the other eye is a little bit away from us, so I try not to emphasize too much. And now I add a little bit of eyebrow. Add a little bit more dark on the side plane of the eye. So this is going to help it to look more dimensional. Hinting some structure of the lower eyelid. Just a little hint of that. This is actually the second time I paint this portrait in watercolor, and the first time I emphasized on the structure a little bit too much and things to become a little bit too contrasty and she started to look older than she should be. So when painting a young lady like her, I think it's important not to emphasize too much on the dark on the structure. It just needs to have a little bit of hint, people can get the structure, and that should be good to go. Less is more is always a good idea. So she's smiling, showing her teeth, and how I usually like to do it is to give that dark corner inside her mouth, as you can see here, and I soften the dark a little bit so it creates that sense of depth. But I don't usually like to paint out individual teeth, because it started to draw too much attention on her mouth. We just need to show the structure of the teeth and the depths on the corner of the mouth. So you just need to be there to convey that she's smiling with her teeth showing, but we don't want it to become a distraction. So some simple shapes and simple light and dark contrast, and you can bring out the structure of the face. You don't always need a very contrast lighting to show the structure of the face. Honestly, this sort of soft lighting I feel is even better for watercolor because watercolor is transparent in nature, and too much dark in a watercolor painting can look a little bit more dirty and messy as well. So I start to paint the hair. I add a little bit of blue just for fun. Since we're painting color, so I like to play around with color a little bit more. And also transition tone from the hair to the skin. So the reason I show both procreate drawing and watercolor is not to compare which one looks better. Everyone has their preference. A lot of people seem to enjoy watercolor more. I guess it's more lively and it has color. But that being said, both require solid understanding of the human facial structure and the proportion. Because if you have that, no matter what medium you use, your face, your portrait can still look solid. It's going to look a little bit different each time you draw because we are human, so we tend to make human errors, and especially I eyeball things, so things are going to look a little bit different, but it's going to look like a solid portrait no matter what if you have the solid understanding of the basic human structure and the proportion. Those are the important things. So after you get that, your choice of medium is entirely up to you. Some people also ask me, is there watercolor brush in Procreate? There is, but I don't like to use it. If I want to paint in watercolor, then I will paint in watercolor because the experience is completely different. Part of the fun in watercolor is the experience when you're painting it. The sense of wet on wet, the sense of brush going over the paper. Those are the important things that cannot replace by working digitally. So even if you can make the end product looks almost the same as watercolor with digital tools, I choose not to do that because it's just not as fun. That's just my personal preference though. So as you can see, after I start to paint the darker hair, the whole portrait start to come together a little bit better. It feels that it has a little bit more weight to it. I also added some background to bring out her shoulder. Her hair is actually quite dark, but I decided to keep it a little bit lighter just to make the overall watercolor looks a little bit fresher and cleaner. So her hair looks like she just got off bed. Like she has this kind of bed hair looking, which is actually nice. I actually like it quite a bit. It's kind of nice and fluffy, so it's kind of fun to paint. Again, this is the second time I paint this portrait, and the first one, I won't exactly call it a failure, but I'm definitely not happy with that one. I'm much happier with this one, even though it's not perfect, but I'm happy when I'm able to paint the best that I can. And sometimes you might be frustrated that you cannot produce a good painting, or you are not able to produce a painting that you imagine from your mind. It can feel quite discouraging and deflating, but that actually might be a sign of your improvement, because when you are starting to develop better taste and as your skill progressing, your standards start to raise. You start to set higher bar to the painting that you see, including your own painting. So whenever that happens, your result after doesn't catch up to your expectation. It's a natural process when you're learning painting, and it happens to me over and over again. So if that happens to you, don't feel deflated or discouraged. It's definitely part of the growing pain, but it's actually a good sign that you are indeed improving and you can start to see things better. And that's the first step to become a better painter and better artist. And I'm currently definitely going through this stage again as well. So I'm right there with you. I look at my own painting and I can't help but feel a little bit discouraged because I believe I can paint better, but often the result is a little bit more disappointing. So that's the reason I start over this painting and I did it again. And I'm much happier with the second one. And that's the process of getting better. You're frustrated about your result, so you try it again. So sometimes I paint the same painting 2 to 3 times, sometimes even 4 times if I really didn't get the result that I want. So persistence is very important for an artist. This second attempt, I like the freshness of the painting a lot better. It looks a lot nicer and simpler. The likeness still not all the way there yet, but that's not something that I'm really focusing on. So the painting is close to finish. I start to come back in and paint some dark details, adding some forms on the hair just to make it a little bit more dimensional, and the subtle hint of her tank top, and adding some transitional value in between. Here is the finished painting, and I put it side by side with the drawing. They look quite different, although you can probably tell it's the same person. It's going to look a little bit different. I like them both. In most cases, I don't do the same portrait in both medium because I don't want this comparison, because it's not really about medium for me. But this one I decided to do both because I like this photo a lot, so I think it would be a waste if I just did one. Hopefully you like this video. If you're new here, please consider like and subscribe. You can also check out my video on how to mix a easy skin tone if you're into portrait. I'm Eric from Cafe Watercolor. Hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are. I will see you next time.